Nichomachean Ethics, Book 7, Section 1, Moral Strength and Moral Weakness, their relation to virtue and vice and current beliefs about them. We have to make a fresh start now by pointing out that the qualities of character to be avoided are three in kind: vice, moral weakness, and brutishness. The opposites of two of these are obvious. One is called virtue or excellence, and the other moral strength. The most fitting description of the opposite of brutishness would be to say that it is superhuman virtue, a kind of heroic and divine excellence, just as Homer has Priam about Hector and that he was of surpassing excellence. For he did not seem like one who was child of a mortal man, but of God. Therefore, if, as is said, an excess of virtue can change a man into God, the characteristic opposed to brutishness must evidently be something of this sort. For just as vice and virtue do not exist in brute beast, no more can they exist in a god. The qualities of gods is something more worthy of honor than human virtue or excellence, and the quality of a brute is generically different from human vice. If it is rare to find a man who is divine, as the Spartans, for example, customarily used the attribute divine man to express an exceptionally high degree of admiration for a person, it is just as rare that a brute is found among men. It does not happen particularly among barbarians, but in some cases disease and physical disability can make a man brutish. Brutishness is also used as a term of opprobrium for those who exceed in all other men in vice. But we must defer until later some mention of this kind of disposition, and vice has already been discussed. We must now discuss moral weakness, softness, and effeminacy, and also moral strength and tenacity. We will do so on the assumption that each of these two sets of characteristics is neither identical with virtue or with wickedness, nor generically different from it, but different species respectively of the covering genera, namely qualities to be sought and qualities to be avoided. The proper procedure will be the one that we have followed in our treatment of other subjects. We must present phenomena, that is, the observed fact of moral life and the current beliefs about them, and after first stating the problem inherent in these, we must, if possible, demonstrate the validity of all the beliefs about these matters, and if not, the validity of most of them or of the most authoritative. For if the difficulties are resolved and current beliefs are left intact, we shall have proved their validity sufficiently. Now the current beliefs are as follows. 1. Moral strength and tenacity are qualities of great moral value and deserve praise, while moral weakness and softness are base and deserve blame. 2. A man who is morally strong tends to abide by the rules of his calculation, and a morally weak man tends to abandon them. 3. A morally weak man does, on the basis of emotion, what he knows to be base, whereas a morally strong man, knowing that a certain appetites are base, refuses to follow them and accepts the guidance of reason. 4. Though a self-controlled man is called morally strong and tenacious, some people affirm and others deny the converse, namely, that a morally strong person is self-controlled in every respect. Likewise, some people call a self-indulgent person morally weak, and a morally weak person self-indulgent, without discriminating between the two, while others say that they are different. 5. Sometimes it is said that a man of practical wisdom cannot possibly be morally weak, and sometimes people who have practical wisdom and who are clever are said to be morally weak. 6. Finally, it is said that moral weakness is shown even in anger and in the pursuit of honor and profit. These, then, are the opinions commonly heard. Section 2. Problems in the current beliefs about moral strength and moral weakness. The problems we might raise are these. As to 3, how can a man be morally weak in his actions when his basic assumption is correct as to what he should do? Some people claim that it is impossible for him to be morally weak if he has knowledge of what he ought to do. Socrates, for example, believed that it would be strange if a man possesses knowledge, something else should overpower it and drag it about like a slave. In fact, Socrates was completely opposed to the view that a man may know what is right but do what is wrong, and did not believe that moral weakness exists. He claimed that no one acts contrary to what is best in the conviction that what he is doing is bad, but through ignorance of the fact that it is bad. Now, this theory is plainly at variance with the observed facts, and one ought to investigate the emotion involved in the acts of a morally weak man. If it comes about through ignorance, what manner of ignorance is it? For evidently a man who is morally weak in his actions does not think that he ought to act the way he does before he is in the grip of emotion. There are some people who accept only certain points of Socrates' theories, but reject others. They agree that nothing is better or more powerful than knowledge, but they do not agree that no one acts contrary to what he thought was the better thing to do. Therefore, they say a morally weak person does not have knowledge but opinion when he is overpowered by pleasures. However, if it really is opinion and not knowledge, if in other words the basic conviction which resists the emotion is not strong but weak, as it is when people are in doubt, we can forgive a man for not sticking to his opinions in the face of strong appetites. But we do not forgive wickedness or anything else that deserves blame, as moral weakness does. Hence, it must be something stronger than opinion which is overpowered. But does that mean that it is practical wisdom which resists the appetite? This, after all, is the strongest kind of conviction. But that would be absurd, for it would mean that the same man will have practical wisdom and be morally weak at the same time. And there is no one who would assert that it is the mark of a man of practical wisdom to perform voluntarily the basest actions. In addition, it has been shown before that a man of practical wisdom is a man of action, for he is concerned with ultimate particulars, and that he possesses the other virtues. Furthermore, as regards 4, if being a morally strong person involves having strong and base appetites, a self-controlled man will not be morally strong, nor a morally strong man self-controlled. It is out of character for a self-controlled person to have excessive or base appetites. Yet a morally strong man certainly must have such appetites. For if the appetites are good, the characteristic which prevents him from following them is bad, and that would mean that moral strength is not always morally good. If, on the other hand, our appetites are weak and not base, there is nothing extraordinary in resisting them, nor is it a great achievement if they are base and weak. Again, to take 1 and 2, if moral strength makes a person abide by any and every opinion, it is a bad thing. For example, if it makes him persist in a false opinion, and if moral weakness makes a man abandon any and every opinion, moral weakness will occasionally be morally good, as for example in the case of Ptolemaeus in Sophocles' below seats. Neoptolemus deserves praise when he does not abide by the resolution which Odysseus had persuaded him to adopt, because it gives him pain to tell a lie. Further, concerning 1 and 3, the sophistic argument presents a problem. The sophists want to refute their opponents by leading them to conclusions which contradict generally accepted facts. Their purpose is to have success, bring them the reputation of being clever, and the syllogism which results only becomes a problem or quandary for their opponents. For the mind is in chains when, because it is dissatisfied with the conclusion it has reached, it wishes not to stand still, while on the other hand, its inability to resolve the argument makes forward movement impossible. Now they have one argument which leads to the conclusion that folly combined with moral weakness is virtue. This is the way it runs. If a man is both foolish and morally weak, he acts contrary to his conviction because of his moral weakness. But because of his folly, his conviction is that good things are bad and that he ought not to do them. Therefore, acting contrary to his conviction, he will do what is good and not what is bad. A further problem arises from 2 and 4. A person who in his actions pursues and prefers what is pleasant, convinced or persuaded that it is good, would seem to be better than one who acts the same way, not on the basis of calculations, but because of moral weakness. For since he may be persuaded to change his mind, he can be cured more easily. To a morally weak man, on the other hand, applies the proverb, "When water chokes you, what can you wash it down with?" For if it had been persuaded to act the way he does, he would have stopped acting that way when persuaded to change his mind. But as it is, though persuaded that he ought to do one thing, he nevertheless does another. Finally, if everything is the province of moral weakness and moral strength, who would be morally weak in the unqualified sense of the word? No one has every form of moral weakness, but we do say of some people that they are morally weak in an unqualified sense. These are the sort of problems that arise. Some of the conflicting opinions must be removed and others must be left intact, for the solution of a problem is the discovery of truth. Section 3. Some problems solved, moral weakness and knowledge. Our first step is then to examine 1. Whether morally weak people act knowingly or not, and if knowingly, in what sense. Secondly, we must establish the kind of questions with which a morally weak and a morally strong man are concerned. Are they concerned with all pleasure and pain, or only with certain distinct kinds of them? Is a morally strong person the same as a tenacious person, or are they different? Similar questions must also be asked about all other matters germane to this study. The starting point of our investigation is the question A, whether the morally strong man and the morally weak man have their distinguishing features in the situations with which they are concerned or in their manner of reacting to the situation. What I mean is this. Does a morally weak person owe his character to certain situations to which he reacts, or the manner in which he reacts, or both? Our second question, B, is whether or not moral weakness and moral strength are connected with all situations and feelings. The answer to both these questions is that a man who is morally weak in the unqualified sense is not so described because of his reaction to every situation, but only to those situations in which also a self-indulgent man may get involved. Nor is he morally weak because of the mere fact of his relationship to these situations, namely that he yields to temptation. In that case, moral weakness would be the same as self-indulgence. Instead, his moral weakness is defined by the manner in which he yields. For a self-indulgent person is led on by his own choice, since he believes that he should always pursue the pleasure of the moment. A morally weak man, on the other hand, does not think he should, but pursues it nonetheless. 1. The contention that is true opinion rather than knowledge, by which a morally weak man violates in his actions, has no bearing on our argument. For some people have no doubts when they hold an opinion and think they have an exact knowledge. Accordingly, if we're going to say that the weakness of their belief is the reason why those who hold opinions liable to act against their conviction than those who have knowledge, we shall find that there is no difference between knowledge and opinion. For some people are no less firmly convinced of what they believe than are others of what they know. Heraclitus is a case in point. A. But the verb to know has two meanings. A man is said to know both when he does not use the knowledge he has and when he does use it. Accordingly, when a man does wrong, it will make a difference whether he is not exercising the knowledge he has, viz., that it is wrong to do what he is doing, or whether he is exercising it. In the latter case, we would be baffled, but not if he acted without exercising his knowledge. Moreover, B, since there are two kinds of premise, namely universal and particular, it may well happen that a man knows both major and minor premise of a practical syllogism, and yet acts against his knowledge because the minor premise which he uses is universal rather than the particular. In that case, he cannot apply his knowledge to his action, for the action to be performed are particulars. Also, there are two kinds of universal term to be distinguished. One applies to I, the agent, and the other I to the thing. For example, when a person knows that dry food is good for all men, he may also know that he is a man, or I that this kind of food is dry. But whether the particular food before him is of this kind is something of which a morally weak man either does not have the knowledge or does not exercise it. So we see that there will be a tremendous difference between these two ways of knowing. We do not regard it as at all strange that a morally weak person knows in the latter sense with one term non-specific, but it would be surprising if he knew in the other sense, namely with both terms apprehended as concrete particulars. There is C, another way besides those we have so far described, in which it is possible for men to have knowledge. When a person has knowledge but does not use it, we see that having a characteristic has different meanings. There is a sense in which a person both has and does not have knowledge, for example, when he is asleep, mad, or drunk. But this is precisely the condition of people who are in the grip of emotions. Fits of passion, sexual appetites, and some other such passions actually cause palpable changes in the body, and in some cases even produce madness. Now it is clear that we must attribute to the morally weak a condition similar to that of men who are asleep, mad, or drunk. That the words they utter spring from knowledge as to what is good is no evidence to the contrary. People can repeat geometrical dimensions and verses of empedocles even when affected by sleep, madness, and drink. And beginning students can reel off the words they have heard, but they do not yet know the subject. The subject must grow to be a part of them, and that takes time. We must therefore assume that a man who displays moral weakness repeats the formulae of moral knowledge, in the same way as an actor speaks his lines. Further, D, we must also look at the cause of moral weakness from the viewpoint of science of human nature. In the following way, in the particular syllogism, one of the premises, the universal, is a current belief, while the other involves particular facts which fall within the domain of sense perception. When two premises are combined into one, i.e., when the universal rule is realized in a particular case, the soul is thereupon bound to affirm the conclusion, and if the premises involve action, the soul is bound to perform this act at once. For example, if the premises are, everything sweet ought to be tasted, and this thing before me is sweet, this thing, perceived as an individual particular object, a man who is able to taste and is not prevented, is bound to act accordingly at once. Now suppose that there is within us one universal opinion forbidding us to taste things of this kind, and other universal opinion which tells us that everything sweet is pleasant, and also a concrete perception determining our activity that the particular thing before us is sweet, and suppose further that the appetite for pleasure happens to be present. The result is that one opinion tells us to avoid that thing, while appetite, capable as it is of setting in motion each part of our body, drives us to it. This is the case we have been looking for, the defeat of reason and moral weakness. Thus, it turns out that a morally weak man acts under the influence of some kind of reasoning and opinion, an opinion which is not intrinsically but only incidentally opposed to right reason. For it is not opinion but appetite that is opposed to right reason. And this explains why animals cannot be morally weak. They do not have conceptions of universals, but have only the power to form mental images and memory of particulars. How is the temporary ignorance of a morally weak person dispelled, and how does he regain his active knowledge of what is good? The explanation is the same as it is for drunkenness and sleep. It is not peculiar to the effect of moral weakness. To get it, we have to go to the students of natural science. The final premise, consisting as it does in an opinion about an object perceived by the senses, determines our action. When in the grip of emotion, a morally weak man either does not have this premise, or he has it not in the sense of knowing it, but in the sense of uttering it as a drunken man may utter verses of Empedocles. Because he is not in active possession of this premise, and because the final concrete term of his reasoning is not a universal, and does not seem to be an object of scientific knowledge, and the same way that a universal is, for both these reasons, we seem to be led to the conclusion which Socrates sought to establish. Moral weakness does not occur in the presence of knowledge in the strict sense, and it is sensory knowledge, not science, which is dragged about by emotion. This completes our discussion of the question whether a morally weak person acts with knowledge or without knowledge, and in what sense is it possible for him to act knowingly. Section 4. More problems solved. The sphere in which moral weakness operates. The next point we have to discuss is whether it is possible for a man to be morally weak in the unqualified sense, or whether the moral weakness of all who have it is concerned with particular situations. 2. If the former is the case, we shall have to see with what kind of situations he is concerned. Now, it is clearly in their attitude to pleasures and pains that men are morally strong and tenacious, and morally weak and soft. There are two sources of pleasure. Some are necessary, and others are desirable in themselves, but admit of excess. The necessary kind are those concerned with the body. I mean sources of pleasure such as food and drink and sexual intercourse, in short, the kind of bodily pleasures which we assign to the sphere of self-indulgence and self-control. By sources of pleasure which are not necessary but desirable in themselves, I mean, for example, victory, honor, wealth, and similar good and pleasant things. Now, A, those who violate the right reason that they possess by excessive indulgence in the second type of pleasures are not called morally weak in the unqualified sense, but only with a qualification. We call them morally weak in regard to material goods, or profit or honor or anger, but not morally weak pure and simple. They are different from the morally weak in the unqualified sense and share the same name only by analogy, as in our example of the man called man who won an Olympic victory. In this case, there is not much difference between the general definition of man and the definition proper to him alone, and yet there was a difference. There is similarly a difference between these two senses of morally weak, is shown by the fact that we blame moral weakness, regardless of whether it is moral weakness in the unqualified sense, or moral weakness concerning some particular bodily pleasure, not only as an error, but also as a kind of vice. We do not blame as vicious those who are morally weak in matters of material goods, profit, ambition, anger, and so forth. B. We now come to those bodily enjoyments which we say are the sphere of the self-controlled and the self-indulgent. Here a man who pursues the excess of things pleasant and avoids excess of things painful, of hunger, thirst, heat, cold, and of anything we feel by touch or taste, and does so not by choice but against his choice and thinking, is called morally weak. Without the addition of in regard to such and such, e.g., in regard to feelings of anger, but simply morally weak without qualification. The truth of this is proved by the fact that persons who indulge in bodily pleasures are called soft, but not persons who indulge in feelings of anger and so forth. For this reason, we class the morally weak man with the self-indulgent and the morally strong with the self-controlled. But we do not include in the same category those who indulge in feelings of anger, because moral weakness and self-indulgence are in a way concerned with the same pleasures and pains. That is, they are concerned with the same pleasures and pains, but not in the same way. Self-indulgent men pursue the excess by choice, but the morally weak do not exercise choice. That is why we are probably more justified in calling a person self-indulgent who shows little or no appetite in pursuing an excess of pleasures and in avoiding moderate pains than a person who is driven by strong appetite to pursue pleasure and to avoid pain. For what would the former do if in addition he had the vigorous appetite of the youth and felt strong pain at lacking the objects necessary for his pleasure? Some appetites and desires are generally noble and worthwhile. Let us remember our earlier distinction of pleasant things into those which are by nature desirable, the opposite of these, and those which are intermediate between the two. For example, material goods, profit, victory, and honor. Now, people are not blamed for being affected by all these and similar objects of pleasure, and by those of the intermediate kind, nor are they blamed for having an appetite or a liking for them. They are blamed only for the manner in which they do so, if they do so to excess. This, by the way, is why we do not regard as wicked all those who, contrary to the right reason, are overpowered by something that is noble and good by nature, or who pursue it. Those, for example, who devote themselves to the pursuit of honor, or to their children and parents more than they should. All these things are good, and those who devote themselves to them are praised, and yet even here there is an element of excess. If, like Niobe, one were to fight against the gods for the sake of one's children, or if one showed the same excessively foolish devotion to his father as did Satyros, nicknamed the Philal, so we see there cannot be any wickedness in this area, because as we stated, each of these things is in itself naturally desirable. But excess in one's attachment to them is base and must be avoided. Similarly, there cannot be moral weakness in this area of things naturally desirable. Moral weakness is not only something to be avoided, but it is also something that deserves blame. Still, because there's a similarity in the effect, people do call it moral weakness. But they add in regard to such and such in the same way as they speak of a bad doctor or a bad actor without meaning to imply that the person is bad in the unqualified sense. So just as the case of the doctor and the actor, we do not speak of badness in the unqualified sense because their badness is not vice, but only something similar to vice by analogy. So it is clear that in the other case we must understand by moral weakness and moral strength only that which operates in the same sphere as self-control and self-indulgence. When we use these terms of anger, we do so only in an analogous sense. Therefore, we add a qualification and say morally weak in regard to anger, just as we say morally weak in regard to honor or profit. Section 5. Moral weakness and brutishness. 1. Some things are pleasant by nature, partly A, without qualification, and partly B, pleasant for different classes of animals and humans. Then 2, there are things which are not pleasant by nature, but which come to be pleasant, A, through physical disability, B, through habit, or C, through an innate depravity of nature. We can observe characteristics or corresponding to each of the latter group 2, as we did in discussing 1, things pleasant by nature, 2C, characteristics of brutishness, for instance, the female, who is said to rip open pregnant women and devour the infants, or what is related about some of these savage tribes near the Black Sea, that they delight in eating raw meat or human flesh, and that some of them lend each other their children for a feast, or the story about Polaris. These are characteristics of brutishness. Another set of characteristics 2A develops through disease and occasionally through insanity, as for example in the case of the man who through insanity is, for example, in the case of a man who offered his mother as sacrifice to the gods and ate of her, or the case of the slave who ate the liver of his fellow slave. The other characteristics are the result of disease 2B, of habit, e.g. plucking out one's hair, gnawing one's fingernails, or even chewing coal or earth, and also sexual relations between males. These practices are in some cases due to nature, but in other cases they are the result of habit, when, for example, someone has been sexually abused from childhood. When nature is responsible, no one would call the person affected morally weak any more than one would call women morally weak, because they are passive and not active in sexual intercourse. Nor would we apply the term to persons in a morbid condition as a result of habit. To have one of these characteristics means to be outside of the limits of vice, just as brutishness too lies outside the limits of vice. To have such a characteristic and to master them or be mastered by them does not constitute moral strength or weakness in the unqualified sense, but only by analogy, just as a person is not to be called morally weak without qualification when he cannot master his anger, but only morally weak in regard to the emotion involved. For all excessive folly, cowardice, self-indulgence, and ill temper is either brutish or morbid. When someone is by nature the kind of person who fears everything, even the rustling of a mouse, his cowardice is brutish, while a man's fear of the weasel was due to disease. In case of folly, those who are irrational by nature and live only by their senses, as do some distant barbarian tribes, are brutish, whereas those whose irrationality is due to a disease, such as epilepsy or to insanity, are morbid. Sometimes it happens that a person merely possesses one of these characteristics without being mastered by it. For example, if Phalaris had restrained his appetite so as not to eat the flesh of a child, or so as not to indulge in some perverse form of sexual pleasure, but it also happens that a man not only has a characteristic, but is mastered by it. Thus, just as the term wickedness refers in its unqualified sense to a man alone, while in another sense it is qualified by the addition of brutishness or morbid, by brutish or morbid, in precisely the same way it is plain that there is a brutish and morbid kind of moral weakness, i.e., being mastered by brutishness or disease. But in its unqualified sense, the term moral weakness refers only to human self-indulgence. It is accordingly clear that moral weakness and moral strength operate only in the same sphere as do self-indulgence and self-control, and that the moral weakness which operates in any other sphere is different in kind and is called moral weakness only by extension, not in an unqualified sense. Section 6. Moral weakness and anger. At this point, we may observe that moral weakness and anger is less base than moral weakness in regard to the appetites. For one, in a way, anger seems to listen to reason, but to hear wrong, like hasty servants who run off before they have heard everything their master tells them, and fail to do what they were ordered, or like dogs which bark as soon as there is a knock without waiting to see if the visitor is a friend. In the same way, the heat and swiftness of its nature make anger hear but not listen to an order, before rushing off to take vengeance. For the reason and imagination indicate that an insult or a slight has been received, and anger, drawing the conclusion, as it were, that it must fight against this sort of thing, simply flares up at once. Appetite, on the other hand, is no sooner told by reason and perception that something is pleasant than it rushes off to enjoy it. Consequently, while anger somehow follows reason, appetite does not. Hence, appetite is baser than anger. For when a person is morally weak in anger, he is in a sense overcome by reason, but the other is not overcome by reason but by appetite. Further, too, it is much more excusable to follow one's natural desires, inasmuch as we are also more inclined to pardon such appetites as are common to all men, and to the extent that they are all common to all. Now, anger and ill temper are more natural than they are appetites, which make us strive for excess and for what is not necessary. Take the example of the man who is defending himself against the charge of beating his father with the words, "Yes, I did it. My father, too, used to beat his father, and he beat his, and," pointing to his little boy, "he will beat me when he grows up to be a man. It runs in the family." And the story goes that the man who was being dragged out of the house by his son asked him to stop at the door on the grounds that he himself had not dragged his father any further than that. Moreover, 3. The more underhanded a person is, the more unjust he is. Now, a hot-tempered man is not underhanded, nor is anger. It is open, but appetite has the same attribute as Aphrodite, who is called weaver of guile on Cyprus born, and as her pattern-pierced zone, of which Homer says, "Endearment that steals the heart away, even from the thoughtful." Therefore, since moral weakness of this type, which involves the appetite, is more unjust and baser than moral weakness concerning anger, it is this type which constitutes moral weakness in the unqualified sense, and is even a kind of vice. Again, 4. No one feels pain when insulting another without provocation, whereas everyone who acts in a fit of anger acts with pain. On the contrary, whoever unprovoked insults another feels pleasure. If then acts which justify outbursts of anger are more unjust than others, it follows that moral weakness caused by appetite is more unjust than moral weakness caused by anger. Anger does not involve unprovoked insult. Now clear that moral weakness in regard to the appetites is more disgraceful than moral weakness displayed in anger, and also that moral strength and weakness operate in the sphere of the bodily appetites and pleasures. But we must still grasp the distinctions to be made within bodily appetites and pleasures. For as we stated in the beginning, some pleasures are human, i.e. natural in kind as well in degree, while others are brutish, and others again are due to physical disability and disease. It is only with the first group of these, i.e. the human pleasures, that self-control and self-indulgence are concerned. For that reason, we do not call beasts either self-controlled or self-indulgent. If we do so, we do it only metaphorically in cases where a general distinction can be drawn between one class of animals and another on the basis of wantonness, destructiveness, and discriminate voracity. This use is only metaphorical because beasts are incapable of choice and calculation, but animals of this type stand out in the pale of their nature, just as madmen do among humans. Brutishness is a lesser evil than vice, but it is more horrifying, for in a beast the better element cannot be perverted as it can be in man, since it is lacking. To compare a brute beast and a brutish man is like comparing an inanimate with an animate being able to see which is more evil, for the depravity of being which does not possess the source that innates its own motion is always less destructive than the depravity of a beginning that possesses this source, and intelligence is such a source. A similar comparison can be made between injustice as such and an unjust man. Each is in some sense worse than the other, for a bad man can do 10,000 times as much harm as a beast. Section 7. Moral strength and moral weakness, tenacity and softness. As regards the pleasures, pains, appetites, and aversions that come to us through touch and taste, and which we defined earlier as the sphere of self-indulgence and self-control, it is possible to be the kind of person who is overcome even by those which most people master, but it is also possible to master those by which most people are overcome. Those who are overcome by pleasure or master it are respectively morally weak and morally strong, and in the case of pain, they are respectively soft and tenacious. The disposition which characterizes the majority of men lies between these two, although they tend more to the inferior characteristics. Some pleasures are necessary up to a certain point, and others are not, whereas neither excess nor deficiencies of pleasure are necessary. The same is also true of appetites and pains. From all this, it follows that a man is self-indulgent when he pursues excess of pleasure things, or when he pursues necessary pleasures to excess by choice, for their own sakes and not for an ulterior result. A man of this kind inevitably feels no regret and is as a result incorrigible. For a person who feels no regret is incorrigible. A person deficient in this pursuit of the necessary pleasures is the opposite of self-indulgent, and the man who occupies the middle position is self-controlled. In the same way, a man who avoids bodily pain is self-indulgent, provided he does so by choice and not because he is overcome by them. A choice is not exercised by either a person who is driven by pleasure or a person who is avoiding the pain of unsatisfied appetite. There is, accordingly, a difference between indulging by choice and not by choice. Everyone would think worse of a man who would perform some disgraceful act, actuated only slightly or not at all by appetite, than of a person who was actuated by a strong appetite. And we would regard as worse a man who feels no anger, for as he beats another man, than someone who does so in anger. For what would he do if he were in the grip of emotion when acting? Hence, a self-indulgent man is worse than one who is morally weak. So we see that one of the characteristics described, viz. the deliberate avoidance of pain, constitutes rather a kind of softness, while a person possessing the other, viz. the deliberate pursuit of excessive pleasures, is self-indulgent. A morally strong is opposed to a morally weak man, and a tenacious to a soft man. For being tenacious consists in offering resistance, while moral strength consists in mastering. Resistance and mastery are two different things, just as not being defeated differs from winning a victory. Hence, moral strength is more desirable than tenacity. A man who is deficient in his resistance to pains, which most people stand successfully, is soft and effeminate. For effeminacy is a form of softness. A man of this kind lets his cloak trail in order to save himself the pain of lifting it up, and plays the invalid without believing himself to be involved in the misery which a true invalid suffers. The situation is similar in the case of moral strength and moral weakness. If a person is overcome by powerful and excessive pleasures or pains, we are not surprised. In fact, we find it pardonable if he is overcome while offering resistance, as for example, Philoctetes does when bitten by a snake, or as Cercion and Carcinus elope, or as people who try to restrain their laughter burst out in one great guffaw, as actually happened to Xenophantus. But we are surprised if a man is overcome by and unable to withstand those pleasures and pains, which most people resist successfully unless his disposition is congenital or caused by disease, as among the kings of Scythia, for example, in whom softness is congenital, and softness distinguishes the female from the male. A man who loves amusement is also commonly regarded as being self-indulgent, but he's actually soft. For amusement is relaxation inasmuch as it is respite from work, and a lover of amusement is a person who goes for relaxation to excess. One kind of moral weakness is impetuosity, and the other is a lack of strength. People of the latter kind deliberate, but do not abide by the results of their deliberation, because they are overcome by emotion, while the impetuous are driven on by emotion because they do not deliberate. If they deliberated, they would not be driven on so easily. For as those who have just been tickled are immune to being tickled again, so some people are not overcome by emotion, whether pleasant or painful, when they feel and see it coming and have roused themselves and their power of reasoning in good time. Keen and excitable persons are the most prone to the impetuous kind of moral weakness. Swiftness prevents the keen and vehemence in the excitable from waiting for reason to guide them, since they tend to be led by their imagination. 8. Section 8. Moral weakness and self-indulgence. A self-indulgent man, as we stated, is one who feels no regret since he abides by the choices he has made. A morally weak person, on the other hand, always feels regret. Therefore, the formulation of the problem as we posed it above does not correspond to the facts. It is a self-indulgent man who cannot be cured, but a morally weak man is curable. For wickedness is like a disease, such as dropsy or consumption, while moral weakness resembles epilepsy. The former is chronic, the latter intermittent. All in all, moral weakness and vice are generically different from each other. A vicious man is not aware of his vice, but a morally weak man knows his weakness. Among the morally weak, those who lose themselves in emotion, i.e., the impetuous, are better than those who have a rational principle but do not abide by it, i.e., those who lack strength. For they are overcome by a lesser emotion and do not yield without previous deliberation as the impetuous do. A man who has this kind of moral weakness resembles those who get drunk quickly and on little wine or on less wine than most people do. The moral weakness is not a vice, in the strict sense is now evident, though in a certain sense it is perhaps one, for moral weakness violates choice, whereas in the accordance with choice, nevertheless they are similar in the actions to which they lead. Just as Democritus said of the Mysileans are no stupid crew, except that they do what the stupid do. Similarly, the morally weak are not unjust, but they will act like unjust men. A morally weak man is the kind of person who pursues bodily pleasures to excess, and the contrary to right reason, though he is not persuaded that he ought to do so. The self-indulgent, on the other hand, is persuaded to pursue them because he is the kind of man who does so. This means that it is the former who is easily persuaded to change his mind, but the latter is not. For virtue or excellence preserves and wickedness destroys the initiating motive or first cause of action. And in actions, the initiating motive or first cause is the end at which we aim, as the hypotheses are in mathematics. For neither in mathematics nor in moral matters does reasoning teach us the principles or starting points. It is virtue, whether natural or habitual, that inculcates right opinion about the principle or first premise. A man who has this right opinion is self-controlled, and his opposite is self-indulgent. But there exists a kind of person who loses himself under the impact of emotion and violates right reason. A person whom emotion so overpowers that he does not act accordingly to the dictates of right reason, but not sufficiently to make him the kind of man who is persuaded that he must abandon himself completely to the pursuit of such pleasures. This is a morally weak man. He is better than the self-indulgent, and he is not bad in the unqualified sense of the word. For the best thing in him is saved, the principle or premise as to how he should act. Opposed to him is another kind of man who remains steadfast and does not lose himself, at least not under the impact of emotion. These considerations make it clear that moral strength is a characteristic of great moral worth, while moral weakness is bad. Section 9. Steadfastness and moral strength and moral weakness. Is a man morally strong when he abides by any and every dictate of reason and choice, or only when he abides by the right choice? And is a man morally weak when he does not abide by every choice and dictate of reason, or only when he fails to abide by the rational dictate which is not false and the choice which is right? This is the problem we stated earlier, or is it true reason and right choice, such as but any other kind of choice incidentally, to which the one remains steadfast and the other does not? This seems to be the correct answer, for if a person chooses and pursues the attainment of A by means of B, his pursuit and choice are for A as such, but for B incidentally. And by as such we mean in the unqualified sense. Therefore, there is a sense in which one abides by and the other abandons any and every kind of opinion, but in the unqualified sense only true opinion. There are those who remain steadfast to their opinion and are called obstinate. They are hard to convince, and they are not easily persuaded to change their mind. They bear a certain resemblance to a morally strong person, as an extravagant man resembles one who is generous, and a reckless man resembles one who is confident. But they are in fact different in many respects. The one, the morally strong, will be a person who does not change under the influence of emotion and appetite, but on the occasion who will be persuaded by argument. Obstinate men, on the other hand, are not easily persuaded by rational argument, but to appetites they are amenable, and in many cases are driven on by pleasures. The various kinds of obstinate people are the opinionated, the ignorant, and the boorish. The opinionated let themselves be influenced by pleasure and pain. They feel the joy of victory when someone fails to persuade them to change their mind, and they feel pain when their views are overruled, like decrees that are declared null and void. As a result, they bear a greater resemblance to the morally weak than to the morally strong. Then there are those who do not abide by their decisions for reasons other than moral weakness, as for example, Neoptolemus and Sophocles Philoctetes. Granted, it was under the influence of pleasure that he did not remain steadfast, but it was a noble pleasure. It was noble in his eyes to be truthful, but he was persuaded by Odysseus to tell a lie. For not anybody who acts under the influence of pleasure is self-indulgent, bad, or morally weak, but only those who do so under the influence of a base pleasure. There's also a type who feels less joy than he should at the things of the body, and therefore does not abide by the dictates of reason. The medium between this type and the morally weak man is the man of moral strength, for a morally weak person does not abide by the dictates of reason because he feels more joy than he should in bodily things. But the man under discussion feels less joy than he should. But a morally strong man remains steadfast and does not change on either account. Since moral strength is good, it follows that both characteristics opposed to it are bad, as they are in fact turn out to be. But since one of the two opposites is in evidence only in a few people and on few occasions, moral strength is generally regarded as being the only opposite of moral weakness, just as self-control is thought to be the opposed to only to self-indulgence. Since many terms are used in an analogical sense, we have come to speak analogically of the moral strength of a self-controlled man. There is a resemblance between the two, since a morally strong man is the kind of person who does nothing contrary to the dictates of reason under the right influence of bodily pleasures, and the same is true of the self-controlled man. But when a morally strong man has base appetites, a self-controlled man does not, and it is moreover a person who finds no pleasure in anything that violates the dictates of reason. A morally strong man, on the other hand, does find pleasure in such things, but he is not driven by them. There is also a similarity between the morally weak and the self-indulgent, in that both pursue things pleasant to the body, but they are different in that the self-indulgent man thinks that he ought to pursue them, while the morally weak thinks he should not. Section 10. Moral weakness and practical wisdom. It is not possible for the same person to have practical wisdom and be morally weak at the same time. For it has been shown that a man of practical wisdom is ipso facto a man of good character. Moreover, to be a man of practical wisdom, one must not only know what one ought to do, but he must also be able to act accordingly. But a morally weak man is not able to so act. However, there is no reason why a clever man could not be morally weak. That is why occasionally people are regarded as possessing practical wisdom, but as being morally weak at the same time. It is because cleverness differs from practical wisdom in the way we have described in our first discussion of the subject. They are closely related in that both follow the guidance of reason, but they differ in that practical wisdom alone involves moral choice. Furthermore, a morally weak man does not act like a man who has knowledge and exercises it, but like a man asleep or drunk. Although he acts voluntarily, for he knows in a sense what he is doing and what end he is aiming at. He is not wicked because his moral choice is good, and that makes him only half wicked. He is not unjust either, for he is no underhanded plotter, for plotting implies deliberation, whereas one type of morally weak man does not abide by the results of his deliberation, while other, the excitable type, does not even deliberate. So we see that a morally weak person is like the stage, which enacts all the right decrees and has laws of a high moral standard, but does not apply them, a situation which Anaxandrides made fun of. Quote, thus wills the state that cares not for its law. Quote, a wicked man, on the other hand, resembles a state which does apply laws, but the laws are bad. In relation to the characteristics possessed by most people, moral weakness and moral strength lie at the extremes. For a morally strong person remains more steadfast, and morally weak person less steadfast than the capacity of most men permits. kind of moral weakness displayed by excitable people is more easily cured than the moral weakness of those who deliberate but do not abide by their decisions, and those who are morally weak through habituation are more curable than those who are morally weak by nature. For it is easier to change habit than to change nature. Even habit is hard to change precisely because it resembles nature. As Eunice says, a habit friend is of long practice born, that practice ends in fashioning man's nature. We have now completed our definitions of moral strength, moral weakness, tenacity, and softness, and stated how these characteristics related to one another. Section 11. Pleasure, some current views. It is the role of a political philosopher to study pleasure and pain, supreme craftsman of the end to which we look when we call one particular thing bad and another good in the unqualified sense. Moreover, an examination of this subject is one of the tasks we must logically undertake. Since we establish that virtue and vice of character are concerned with pains and pleasures, and most people claim that happiness involves pleasure, this is why the word blessed is derived from the word joy. Now, 1. Some people believe that no pleasure is good, either in itself or incidentally, since the good and pleasure are not the same thing. 2. Others that hold that through the same pleasures are good, most of them are bad. 3. Then there is a third view according to which it is impossible for pleasures to be the highest good, even if all pleasures are good. The following arguments are advanced to support 1. The contention that pleasure is not good at all. A. All pleasure is a process or coming to be leading to the natural state of the subject and perceived by the subject, but no process is of the same order as it ends, e.g., the building process is not of the same order as a house. Further, B. A self-controlled man avoids pleasures. Again, C. A man of practical wisdom does not pursue the pleasant, but what is free from pain. Moreover, D. Pleasures are an obstacle to good sense. The greater joy one feels, e.g., in a sexual intercourse, the greater the obstacle, for no one is capable of irrational insight while also enjoying sexual relations. Also, E. There is no art of pleasure, yet every good is the result of an art. Finally, F. Children and beasts pursue pleasures, whereas they do not know what is good. The arguments for the view, 2, that not all pleasures are good. A. Some pleasures are disgraceful and cause for reproach, and B. Some pleasures are harmful, for there are pleasant things that may cause disease. And the argument in favor of 3, the contention that pleasure is not the highest good, is that it is not an end but a process or coming to be. These are roughly the views put forward. Section 12. The views discussed. 1. Is pleasure a good thing? But the following considerations will show that arguments we have enumerated do not lead us to the conclusion that 1. Pleasure is not good, or 3. That it is not the highest good. In the first place, to answer argument 1a and 3, we use the word good in 2 senses. A thing that may be good in the unqualified sense, or good for a particular person. Hence, the term has also 2 meanings when applied to natural states and characteristics of persons, and consequently also when applied to their motions and processes. This means that motions and processes, which are generally held to be bad, are partly bad without qualification, but not bad for a particular person and even desirable for him. A partly not even desirable for a particular person except on an occasion and for a short time, although they are not desirable in an unqualified sense. Others, again, are not even pleasures, but only appear to be. For example, all processes accompanied by pain and undergone for remedial purposes, such as the process to which the sick are subjected. Secondly, the good has 2 aspects. It is both an activity and a characteristic. Now, the process which restore us to our natural characteristic condition are only incidentally pleasant, but the activity which is at work when our appetites want to see us restored is the activity of that part of our characteristic condition and natural state which has been left unimpaired. For that matter, there are pleasures which do not involve pain and appetite, e.g. the activity of studying. We experience them when there is nothing deficient in our natural state. The process of restoration are only incidentally pleasant, as shown by the fact that the pleasant things which give us joy while our natural state is being replenished are not the same as those which give us joy once it has been restored. Once restored, we feel joy at what is pleasant in the unqualified sense, But while replenishment goes on, we enjoy even its opposite. For instance, we enjoy sharp and bitter things, none of which are pleasant, either by nature or in the unqualified sense. Consequently, the pleasures derived from them too are not pleasant either by nature or in the unqualified sense, for the difference that exists between various pleasant things in the same as which is found between the pleasures derived from them. In the third place, there's no need to believe that there exists something better than pleasure, which is different from it, just as, according to some, the end is better than the process which leads to it. For pleasures are not processes, nor do all pleasures involve processes. They are activities and an end, and they result not from the process of development we undergo, but from the use we make of the powers we have. Nor do all pleasures have an end other than themselves. That is only true of pleasures for those who are being led into the perfection of their natural states. For that reason, it is not correct either to say that pleasure is a process perceived by the subject. One should rather call it an activity of our characteristic condition as determined by our natural state, and instead of perceived, we should call it unobstructed. There are some who believe pleasure to be process on the ground that is good in the true sense of the word, or they think that activity is process, but it is, as a matter of fact, different. The argument to be that pleasures are bad because some pleasant things may cause disease is like arguing that wholesome things are bad because some of them are bad for making money. Both pleasant and wholesome things are bad in the relative sense mentioned, but that does not make them bad in themselves. Even studying is occasionally harmful to health. Also, 1D, neither practical wisdom nor any characteristic is obscured by the pleasures arising from it, but only by alien pleasures extraneous to it. The pleasures arising from the study and learning will only intensify study and learning, but they will never obstruct it. The argument 1E that no pleasure is the result of an art makes good sense, for the art never produces any activity at all. It produces the capacity for the activity. Nevertheless, the arts of perfume making as well as of cooking are generally regarded as arts of pleasure. The arguments 1B that a self-controlled person avoids pleasure, 1C that a man of practical wisdom pursues a life free from pain, and 1F that children and beasts pursue pleasure are all refuted by the same consideration. We have stated in what sense pleasures are good without qualification, and in what sense not all pleasures are good. These last mentioned are the pleasures which beasts and children pursue, while a man of practical wisdom wants to be free from the pain which they imply. They are the pleasures that involve appetite and pain, i.e. the bodily pleasures, for they are of this sort in their excess, in terms of which a self-indulgent man is self-indulgent. That is why a self-controlled man avoids these pleasures, but there are pleasures even for the self-controlled. 13. The views discussed. 3. Is pleasure the highest good? To continue, there's a general agreement that pain is bad and must be avoided. One kind of pain is bad in the unqualified sense, and another is bad because in some way or another it obstructs us. Now, the opposite of a thing is to be avoided in the sense that it must be avoided and is bad is good. It follows, therefore, necessarily that pleasure is a good. Eusebius tried to solve the question by saying that just as the greater is opposed both to the less and to the equal, so is pleasure both to pain and to the good. But this solution does not come out correctly. Surely he would not say that pleasure is essentially a species of evil. But 2a, even if some pleasures are bad, it does not mean that the highest good cannot be some sort of pleasure. Just as the highest good may be some sort of knowledge, even though some things of knowledge are bad. Perhaps we must even draw the necessary conclusion that it is, since each characteristic has its unobstructed activities, the activity of all characteristics, or of one of them, depending on whether the former or the latter constitutes happiness, if obstructed, must be the most desirable of all. And this activity is pleasure. Therefore, the highest good is some sort of pleasure, despite the fact that most pleasures are bad, and if you like bad in the unqualified sense of the word, it is for this reason that everyone thinks the happy life is a pleasant life, and links pleasure with happiness. And it makes good sense this way, for no activity is completed and perfect as long as it is obstructed and happiness is a complete and perfect thing. This is why a happy man also needs the goods of the body, external goods, and the goods of fortune, in order not to be obstructed by their absence. But those who assert that man is happy even on the rack and even when the great misfortunes befall him, provided that he is good, are talking nonsense, whether they know it or not. Since happiness also needs fortune, some people regard good fortune as identical with happiness. But that is not true, even for good fortune, if excessive can be an obstruction. Perhaps we are, in that case, no longer justified in calling it good fortune, for its definition is determined by a relation to happiness. Although the fact that all beasts and all men pursue pleasure is some indication that it is, in a sense, the highest good. There is no talk that ever quite dies down if spread by many men. But since no single nature and no single characteristic condition is or is regarded as the best for all people, do not all pursue the same pleasure, yet all pursue pleasure. Perhaps they do not even pursue the pleasure which they think they would say they pursue, but they all pursue the same thing, pleasure. For everything has by nature something divine about it, but the bodily pleasures have arrogated the name pleasure unto themselves as their own private possession, because everyone tends to follow them and participates in them more frequently than in any others. Accordingly, since these are the only pleasures with they are familiar, people think that they are the only ones that exist. It is also evident that if pleasure, i.e., the activity of our faculties, is not good, it will be impossible for a happy man to live pleasantly. For to what purpose would he need pleasure if it were not good, and if it is possible that a happy man's life is one of pain? For if pain is neither good nor bad, pleasure is not either, so why should he avoid it? Surely the life of a normally good man is no pleasanter than that of anyone else, if his activities are not more pleasant. Section 14. The views discussed. 2. Are most pleasures bad? The subject of the pleasures of the body demands the attention of the proponents of the view that, though some pleasures, for instance, the noble pleasures, are highly desirable, the pleasures of the body, that is, the pleasures which are the concern of the self-indulgent man, are not. If that is true, then why are the pains opposed to them bad? For bad has good as its opposite. Is it that the necessary pleasures are good in the sense in which anything not bad is good, or are they good up to a certain point? For all characteristics and motions which cannot have an excess of good cannot have an excess of pleasure either, but those which can have an excess of good can also have an excess of pleasure. Now, excess is possible in the case of the goods of the body, and it is the pursuit of the excess, but not for the pursuit of the necessary pleasures, that makes a man bad. For all men get some kind of enjoyment from good food, wine, and sexual relations, but not everyone enjoys these things in the proper way. The reverse is true of pain. A bad person does not avoid an excess of it, but he avoids it altogether. For the opposite of an excess is pain, only for the man who pursues the excess. It is our task not only to say what is true, but to also state what causes error, since that helps carry conviction. For when we can give a reasoned explanation why something which appears to be true is in fact not true, it makes us give greater credence to what is true. Accordingly, we must now explain why the pleasures of the body appear to be more desirable. The first reason, then, that pleasure drives out pain. When men experience an excess of pain, they pursue excessive pleasure and bodily pleasure in general in the belief that it will remedy the pain. These remedies' pleasures will become very intense, and that is the very reason why they are pursued, because they are experienced in contrast with their opposite. As a matter of fact, these two reasons, which we have stated, also explain why pleasure is not regarded as having any moral value. Some pleasures are the actions that spring from a bad natural state, either cognitively bad, as in the case of the beast, or bad by habit, as in the case of a bad man, while other pleasures are remedial and indicate a deficient natural state, and to be in one's natural state is better than to be moving toward it. But since the remedial pleasures only arise in the process of reaching the perfected state, they are morally good only incidentally. The second reason is that the pleasures of the body are pursued because of their intensity by those incapable of enjoying other pleasures. Take, for example, those who induce themselves to be thirsty. There is no objection to this practice if the pleasures are harmless, but if they are harmful, it is bad, for many people have nothing else to give them joy, and because of their nature it is painful for them to feel neither pleasure nor pain. Actually, animal nature is under a constant strain, as the students of natural science attest when they say that seeing and hearing are painful, but we do not feel the pain because, as they assert, we have become accustomed to it. Similarly, whereas the growing process we go through in our youth puts us into the same exhilarated state as that of a drunken man, and makes youth the age of pleasure, excitable natures, on the other hand, always need remedial action. As a result of the excess of black bile in their constitutional blend, their bodies are exposed to constant gnawing sensations, and they are always in a state of vehement desire. Now, since pain is driven out by the pleasure opposed to it, or by any strong pleasure at all, excitable people become self-indulgent and bad. Pleasures unattended by pain do not admit of excess. The objects of these pleasures are what is pleasant by nature and not what is incidentally pleasant. By things incidentally pleasant, I mean those that act as remedies, for since it is through some action of that part of us which has remained sound that a cure is effected, the remedy is regarded as being pleasant, but the pleasant by nature it is not. Pleasant by nature are those things which produce the action of an unimpaired natural state. There is no single object that continues to be pleasant forever, because our nature is not simple, but contains another natural element which makes us subject to decay. Consequently, whenever one element does something, it runs counter to the nature of the other, and whenever the two elements are in a state of equilibrium, the act performed seems neither painful nor pleasant. If there is a being with a simple nature, the same action will always be the most pleasant to him. That is why the divinity always enjoys one single and simple pleasure, for there is not only an activity of motion, but also an activity of immobility, and pleasure consists in rest rather than in motion, but change in all things is pleasant, as the poet has it, because of some evil in us. For just as a man who changes easily is bad, so also is a nature that needs to change. The reason is that such a nature is not simple and not entirely good. This completes our discussion of moral strength and moral weakness, and of pleasures and pain. We have stated that each of them, what each of them is, and in what sense some of them are good and some bad. It now remains to talk about friendship